This today is November 9th, 2024. A day like any other day, as was November 9th, 1965, a day like any other day. Except on that day, Roger LaPorte immolated himself in 1965. He set himself on fire and died the next day as his response to the high-tech and financially profitable massacre of the people of Vietnam that the United States politicians and military and business operations were conducting 7,200 miles from the border of the United States. He set himself afire at a time when most of the citizenry of the United States, Catholic and otherwise, were indifferent to the sufferings, the misery that the Vietnamese people were enduring. Roger's sacrifice of his life was his response to this wickedness and to the mass media deceit that was calculatingly covering up the daily fare of atrocities that men in the United States military and their political leaders were committing against the people of Vietnam. When news of Roger's death, the manner of his death, and the motivation for his self-immolation became known, few in the church had a good word to say about him, and most had a clever, subtle, demeaning, and dismissing way of commenting on Roger and his immolation. I personally was appalled then and remained appalled now to this day at the way my fellow Catholics, from Cardinal Spellman to Thomas Merton to Dorothy Day, and most other Catholics I knew, threw Roger overboard at the hour of his death. Yet, I do remember the aura of religious heroism, the almost reverent adulation, which some of these same people treated the self-immolation of the 66-year-old Buddhist monk, Thich Quang Duc, 2.5 years earlier in Saigon on June 11, 1963. And they did this even though they disagreed with self-immolation as a form of protest for themselves. Yet, where Roger was concerned, it was a radically different response, different tenor, different tone that was adopted. But to his eternal credit, Reverend Daniel Berrigan stood by Roger to the end and beyond, and in my mind rightly interpreted Roger's act, his motivation, his witness. Dan did not and would not, nor do I, counsel Roger to choose such a witness. Dan, however, left no doubt that after hearing Roger's deathbed confession in the hospital, that Roger was following his conscience and was not simply trying to commit suicide, but was rather voluntarily accepting suffering and the possibility of death so that others in Vietnam might have their sufferings relieved and their deaths avoided. Dan Berrigan paid a price for standing by Roger publicly and privately. Having, almost immediately after Roger's death, the cruel wrath of Cardinal Spellman and his own Jesuit order and others immediately come down upon him. Now, regardless of how we die, we all die totally dependent on the mercy of God. No one dies saying, Lord, have justice on me. Only, Lord, have mercy. In relation to the Vietnam War, Roger made his choice, and others made their choices. Roger's act resulted in him being burnt to death. The acts of other U.S. Catholics and Christians, resulted in tens of thousands of Vietnamese human beings being burnt to death. Call to mind right now, if you will, in 2024, the Dow chemical napalm holocaust in Vietnam. Imagine the agony of that, even at 55 years distance. That was Roger's agony, multiplied thousands of times over in 1969. Indeed, Dan Berrigan, after visiting Vietnam during the war, called it the land of the burning children. But one will search in vain for evidence that the wrath of Cardinal Spellman or the Jesuit order came down on any of the Catholics who set tens of thousands of human beings on fire in Vietnam, or on any Catholic institution, for example, a university, that taught Catholics to obey those who ordered them to burn Vietnamese people to death. Indeed, today, in the Catholic community, under the authority of the Catholic hierarchy, those people that have burnt tens of thousands of Vietnamese to death are honored, respected, and given credence for what they did by the Catholic Church. I should say there is not any evidence whatsoever also that the wrath of Cardinal Spellman or of the Jesuit order came down on any Catholic or Catholic institution who was indifferent to the destruction of Vietnamese children. Destruction by the truckload each day. And as is the case today in 2024, in the Catholic hierarchy and in the Catholic Church in general, in relation to the genocide that is now taking place against the children of Palestine. There is no significant, sustained, meaningful, pragmatic, public response by the Catholic leadership of the Catholic community. Certainly, no cardinal And nor would I suggest any cardinal or pope, nor would I suggest any pope immolate himself as Roger LaPorte did for the Vietnamese people. But how many cardinals and what pope is going to take on suffering, intense suffering? Perhaps the intense suffering of going to Palestine and staying with the people there, all during the bombings and the napalming and the machine gunning and the anti-aircraft fire for as long as the genocide goes on. I don't know. I suspect none. But what I do know is this, that Roger LaPorte saw terrible suffering that no one else or few others in his day saw in the church or outside the church. And he tried to respond. He tried to respond in a way that he thought would be effective, in a way that he thought could grab people's minds and hearts to the plight of what was being done to the average person in Vietnam in 1965. His choice would not be the choice that I would make, but his intention when he saw suffering was to try to relieve it. And that, we are told in Matthew 25 by Jesus, is probably the ultimate standard for judgment at the edge of eternity. This is Emmanuel Charles McCarthy.